So it's my pleasure to invite you today, another minister from the Finnish presidency after the minister in charge of agriculture and forests. Yesterday we have the chance to have Ms. Mikkonen in charge of environment and climate change for an exchange of view this morning, and then we will have another opportunity with the minister in charge of family affairs and health, and we will of course focus our questions on health issues in the remit of this committee. So before having this exchange of views, I will make a couple of announcements after the coordinators meeting of the 18th of July. So the first thing is I have to formally ask the coordinators if they have remarks on the minutes circulated electronically. I guess they don't. I can't see any remarks, so we can consider as a chair that it is agreed among coordinators, and I can share with you three information after the decisions made during the first coordinators meeting. So the first decision was to invite for an exchange of views Commissioner Malmström in our first September meeting on Mercosur, so that we can have plenty of time to ask questions about the connection between this trade agreement and the issues dealt with by this committee, whether we talk about climate change or food safety or biodiversity. So the invitation will be sent today. Another invitation will be sent to Commissioner Bulc for transport, also for an exchange of views for our next meeting in September, in order to inform us and answer your questions about the current development of the discussion, negotiation within the ICAO scheme about the CORSIA, so the CORSIA is the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, that might have huge impact on our capacity to regulate aviation sector through the potential extension of ETS, free allowances, and so on and so on and so on. So debate we have had in this House and with the Commission and states for long, but there is an international discussion that of course might have a huge impact on our EU capacity to have our rules, so we need to have an exchange of views with the Commissioner in charge. Both will take place in our first meeting in September. Third and last point about the CAP. So we discussed this issue with the coordinators, and we decided not to reopen the NV position, the former NV position or the current NV position took by the previous NV committee, in order to be able to speed up the process and not to reopen everything. And in a letter I'm going to send today to my counterpart in the Agri Committee, we of course offer to rediscuss with the Agri members for potential compromises, because as you might know, NV is partly associated to the CAP reform, and there were a lot of frustration, I was told that, from a lot of members in this committee. So we will propose to rediscuss the potential compromised amendments before going to the plenary, with the Agri Committee. So that's the official NV position decided with the coordinators. It will be sent today to the Agri Chair, and there will be this morning, I guess, a coordinators meeting within the Agri Committee, and we will see how things evolve. Of course, having in mind that Agri has the lead, so we'll have to adjust our own decisions regarding their own. So, three key topics for the next meetings, and the first two related to the first meeting in September. So we can move to the formal exchange of views with you, Minister. So you have 10 to 12 minutes in order to, I forgot one point. I was also, as NV chair, invited by my counterpart in INTA. This morning they have an exchange of views with Commissioner Malmström on Mercosur, and the coordinators and the chair in INTA offered us, through the chair, a slot to have a couple of questions, fact-based questions, so I will have to leave the session and the exchange of views at 10:30, and I will be back, and Bas Aykut, as first vice president, will take the floor as chair here to handle this exchange of views. So, back to you. Thank you again for being here with us. A lot of questions, a lot of expectations for the Finnish presidency, so up to you for 10 to 12 minutes.
Thank you. Dear Chair, honourable members of European Parliament, it's my pleasure to be here and tell you about the Finnish presidency. And I know that you already met one Finnish minister yesterday, and there's one more coming after me, so many greetings from Finland, from all of us. But well, our plans of the Finnish presidency of the Council in the field of environment and climate is my topic. And let's start with the hard data. We know that June 2019 was the warmest June on record, both for Europe and the globe. The rate of global change in nature in the past 50 years is something we have never seen before in human history. These are key messages from Copernicus data and IPBES Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. These messages, along with the IPCC 1.5 degrees report, demonstrate that the window of opportunity to prevent irreversible damage to the planet and humanity is narrowing quickly. In other words, we must take necessary actions and decisions now. We must be honest to ourselves and to our citizens. We have a systemic challenge, and it should be the starting point for making European policies in the next 5 years. It is in this global setting and in a moment of institutional change in the EU that Finland has taken over the presidency of the European Union, a challenging but a crucial time. The new European Parliament and European Commission will take their first steps during the Finnish presidency. We have noted with interest the debate the European Parliament held with the now confirmed President of the European Commission only a week ago. We want to drive together a positive agenda to help in building the response to the key challenges of our time, climate change and biodiversity loss. What will this agenda mean in practice during the 6-month presidency? Regarding climate and environment, the Finnish presidency will have 3 priorities. First, EU's global leadership in climate action. Second, ambitious work for biodiversity post-2020. And third, advancing circular economy. First, EU's climate action. A key priority of Finland's presidency is the EU's global leadership in climate action. We already have the most ambitious targets among the industrialized economies in place and a binding legislative framework that will deliver our current commitments. But we must not stop here. For the European Union, global leadership means committing to climate neutrality by 2050. We aim to advance the process to reach a common agreement on the main elements of the EU's long-term climate strategy before the end of the year, as requested by the European Council. We will have a number of sectoral policy debates in the Council to advance work on the needed conditions. the incentives, and the enabling framework. Formal Council debates on issues related to the EU's long-term climate strategy take place in the Council of Employment and Social Policy, Transport and Environment. Some other Council formations and informal ministerial meeting will also address topics related to the transition towards climate neutrality. In addition, preparations for the September UN General Secretary's Climate Action Summit took place in the informal Environment and Climate Ministers meeting in Helsinki 2 weeks ago, where we had a sincere discussion about the EU's common message to the summit. What I took from this discussion was that in addition to giving strong signals of our commitment to the finalization of our long-term strategy, we have a strong story to tell. We have a legally binding 2030 framework, and we have also taken climate policies to the relevant sectoral policies and EU budget. The EU also remains committed to communicate or update its NDC by 2020. We have important political decisions ahead of us, and a lot of work still needs to be done in order to have the EU's long-term vision ready by the end of the year. We will also lead the preparation for the COP25 in Chile, and Council conclusions on this will be adopted in the October Environmental Council. Our second priority, biodiversity, was also a topic for discussion during the informal meeting of climate and environmental ministers. We will now go on with all the necessary follow-up work and discussion. The aim is to adopt Council conclusions in the December Environment Council. The harsh truth is that we are severely lagging behind our goal for stopping the loss of biodiversity, both in Europe and globally. The problem is not in the goal, it is in the implementation. Habitat loss, unsustainable practices in the ways we manage our land and waters, and the increasing use of natural resources are crucial parts of the problem. My key takeaway from the biodiversity discussion with Member States is that there is a strong will for a credible and measurable global biodiversity framework for the next decade. We also have a shared understanding that stopping biodiversity loss is not only about nature conservation. Biodiversity should be taken account in all relevant sectoral policies, just as climate change. The Finnish presidency will start work for ambitious EU position for the Convention on Biological Diversity and its Conference of Parties, COP15, that will agree on a new post-2020 global biodiversity framework in October 2020 in Kunming, China. The aim of the Finnish presidency is to find common ground and prepare for the upcoming negotiations on biodiversity, as well as give clear input for the post-2020 biodiversity framework. Our third priority is the circular economy. Circular economy can be part of the solution to the dual challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. Shifting to a truly circular economy can offer ways to address the sustainability crisis. We plan to adopt Council conclusions on the circular economy in the October Environmental Council. The circular economy has also discussed by climate and environmental ministers in Helsinki 2 weeks ago. The circular economy means managing ecosystem in a way that allows them to regenerate, in order to conserve major ecological services and restore natural resources while meeting a socio-economic needs of current and future generations. The outcoming Commission paved a strong start for circular economy with its ambitious action plan. During our presidency, we want to give the new Commission a strong message to continue with circular economy also in the next 5 years. There are a number of sectors, such as constructions, textiles, or electronic equipment, where a great amount of resources are being wasted. With the proper policies and standards in place, we could keep raw materials circulating in the European economy and producing value for a longer time. We should design products in a way that makes it easier to repair or reuse them. The circular economy reduces the need for the virgin raw materials and brings down emissions and pressure on the environment. Moreover, the competitiveness of European industry will rely on a more efficient and sustainable use of resources. Circular economy simply makes sense, no matter from what aspect you look at it. The success of these three priorities and of policy in general lies in good implementation. Here, we already have good tools available at the EU level. One of the programs with clear impact in the field of climate change and environmental policy is the 7th Environment Action Programme. It lays down a solid strategy and creates strong links with national measures. The 7th EAP has also contributed a more predictable, faster, and better coordinated actions in the field of environment and climate change policy, and enables the EU to speak with one voice in international environment negotiations. The 7th EAP runs until the end of the next year, but many actions under its priority objectives still need to be completed. For these reasons, the Finnish presidency will also be aiming at adopting Council conclusions as a positive push for the Commission to present the 8th EAP, to build further on the achievements of the 7th and ensure a continued strategic framework for climate and environmental policy action. Turning now to open legislative files during the Finnish presidency. On the 2 legislative files concerning drinking water and water reuse, the aim of the Finnish presidency is to start and finalize trilogue negotiations with the European Parliament. On shipping MRV, we aim to finalize Council's position during our presidency. On life, we are very much in the hands of the European Council and the MFF negotiation, but if possible, we hope to close this file. This committee and your work has been and will be central in the next 5 years. If we are to succeed in driving a positive agenda and building the response to the challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. Looking still at the broader picture, the common agricultural policy together with sustainable finance will be 2 crucial drivers of the transformative change we need. Even though the Environmental Council is not responsible for these policies on the Council side, these discussions will be advanced by the Agriculture and Fisheries Council and the Economic and Financial Affairs Council, respectively. An integrated cross-sectoral approach is what we should strive for. We need to better integrate our climate and environment policies with other policies, starting with the work we do here on an everyday basis. This is why the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, both globally and internally, needs to be a priority of the EU. This brings me back to the global setting, with which I started my speech. We have made good progress in recent years when it comes to climate and environment and the SDGs more broadly, both internally in the EU and globally. But the science is clear, as is the demand by civil society that is growing louder and louder. We need to do more, and the work must start immediately. The window of opportunity is closing fast, but to end at more optimistic note, we still have a window of opportunity. We have important political decisions ahead of us. Dear members of the ENVI Committee, I wish your dedication, wisdom, and passion when you carry out your work for the next 5 years. I look forward to working with you to lead the response to the key challenges of our time. And thank you, and now I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. So, as a reminder, the coordinators will have 2 minutes each for their question. That will be a first set of 7 questions. Then you will have 10 to 15 minutes for answer, and then another round of questions by MEPs. And just for your information, the plane of Cecilia Malmström was cancelled, so the hearing will take place this afternoon. So I will stay here as the chair. Sorry, Bas. I don't know if he's here, or he's already left. I know he's here. Yeah, you can have a sleep now. So we start with Peter Liese for the EPP.
Vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender. Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you, Presidency. Now, Mrs. von der Leyen has placed climate at the centre of her ambitions last Tuesday, and has also developed very ambitious targets and objectives for the EU in this regard. And what I very much welcome myself is that you have announced to do something about aviation. She certainly did. Now, the EU, when it comes to emissions trading, should be dealing with aviation in addition to those who are using the road, which is also environmentally not environmentally friendly, and our citizens certainly want that to be changed. So I would welcome it if you could support Mrs. von der Leyen's ambitions here. But now there's also the ICAO, and they're planning an agreement where emissions trading becomes impossible, and I think that would be detrimental to environmental protection. That's certainly something we need to look at, and that's something the chairman himself mentioned. Now, for the EPP, it's important to look at technology and research, and to make sure that those regions who still depend on coal can be supported, and that they can be in transition. We need money for that, and that's why Prime Ministers need to understand that we can't just make cuts to the MFF, but that there are major challenges ahead of us and that we need the necessary resources to tackle those. Then my last point is the global importance and the global challenge of climate change. Now, if I look at other industrialized countries such as Australia, Japan, and the US, then it's clear that they're not making the same efforts as we are. The targets set in Paris are not targets that they're trying to go beyond. And we're talking about global warming, of course, and we can only stop that if there's a global effort to counter it. So I think we also need to call on our partners to do more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For the Socialists and Democrats, Seb Dance.
Oh, no, it's that one. Thank you very much, Minister, for outlining the areas that you intend to focus on, including some of the outstanding bits of legislation that are going through this place. I'm starting to worry that in terms of our need to focus on people and their reaction to climate change, that we are somewhat falling behind what people are prepared to do in terms of personal actions to adapt lifestyles, but also to respond to some of the bits of work and legislation that we are putting through. I sort of want to cite the Gilets jaunes protests in France, the reaction to a relatively modest increase in energy taxes being misconstrued as an attack on everybody's lives and their ability to pay their way. This is really a sort of action that we all need to take in this Parliament to help lead that paradigm shift. But has there been any thought within the Finnish government about how they might work with member states in the council to help drive that paradigm shift as well? We're all rapidly approaching a situation where the time frame that you talked about, the time window that you talked about, will shrink ever more, and the scale of action that we will need to take will be that much more ambitious. And the more ambitious it is, the bigger the backlash we have. What proposals do you have to help drive that paradigm shift? Have there been any discussions about funds for a just transition to ensure that communities that are on the very sharp end of climate change will have the financial support that they need? What reaction have you had from other member states, if you have had that discussion, and do you sense there's a willingness amongst member state governments to really lead this work collectively? Because we need to do an awful lot of work in what will be a very short amount of time.
Thank you. Nils Torvalds for Renew.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to the Environmental Committee. You said in your speech that we need to do more, and I'm pretty sure that it's a growing understanding among all of us and among the citizens that we really do need to do something more, and that we, in the start for this century and for this decade, had goals which were probably not so ambitious as they could have been, because we were able to fulfill them at a very early stage. But the problem is the complexity of the issue. When we discuss different ways of attacking the problem, we see that different parties, different countries, different NGOs start from very different ends of the question. When we discussed with the Commission the strategy paper, I think the intention of the Commission was to create a system where member states should define their paths towards a neutral future. But the situation of the member states are very diverse, so one size doesn't fit all. So this creates a very complicated and interesting issue, where to start, which wire to, which end to pull. And it would be very interesting to hear what your take would be on this very interesting question. Where to start to get this thing running? Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Blows for the Greens.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister. First of all, I want to congratulate you on your presidency and on your plan to put global warming and the climate crisis at the center of it. And I want to congratulate you for being a global climate champion by committing to a climate neutral Finland by already 2035. In the last months, I spoke to many young people, and I guess we're also many young colleagues here in the House, and a lot of us are afraid that our future lives will be determined by the climate crisis. And I trust that colleagues here in the room and the presidency understands that we are at this breaking point, that there is a high chance of irreversible global warming that makes this planet Earth uninhabitable for us, for human beings. And we as Europeans, we have to lead, especially on the global level. We have to show responsibility and ambition so that others will follow. And yesterday, the UN Secretary General asked the EU to submit a brief summary of our reduction plans already by the 7th of August. What will you, as the presidency of the Council, together with the Commission, submit to the UN Secretary General? Will you be able to fulfill the Paris Agreement that requires the EU to become climate neutral by latest 2050? Will you commit to the 1.5-degree goal? And then you mentioned the climate summit in Chile, where we also have to show ambition. You mentioned the draft Council conclusion, And there, the 2030 target of the EU is still specified at minus 40% emission reduction. This is not in line with the Paris Agreement, and it's not in line with the demands of this House and not with the hopes of the many people that voted in the European election. How do you plan to convince your colleagues in the Council to make Europe the climate champion again and to reduce emission by at least 55% by 2030? And last but still important, you said that we have to start immediately. And in the face of this climate emergency, we know that the shutting down the lignite power plants are the low-hanging fruit to lower CO2 emissions in the EU now. What do you and what does your government think should we as the EU do now in order to immediately decrease our CO2 emissions? Thank you very much.
Thank you. For the ID group, Teuvo Akarainen.
Arvoisa puheenjohtaja.
Chair, Minister Mikkonen. Climate has always changed during the whole era when our planet has existed. The climate will go on changing. We've even had an ice age, and the sun is the key question. The sun determines what happens on our planet, both in the short term and the long term, and the effects of all of the mankind are limited. Our times are not in any way special, although climate change has become a new religion, and challenging that has become blasphemy almost. There is this horror scenario of climate warming, but long-term statistics do not support this vision. People try to prove that the climate is warming and use fake statistics for that. Unfortunately, the official climate madness is alive, well and well. Of course, there are people who may try to fearmonger and talk about the apocalypse, and it's very distressing that the Finnish government has really bought into this hook, line and sinker. And it's an idea of tightening taxation. The Finnish government appeals to something that's supposedly a good thing. The church used to sell arms, and this is back. When you drop money in the box, the climate will become cooler. That's the idea. Of course, we must reduce emissions. But has the minister taken into account that the total emissions of Finland are about 656, whatever the decision is. I can't remember the definition of the emissions, but in developing countries like India and China, there the emissions grow 13 times as much as Finnish total emissions. Shouldn't we look at these big pigs first?
So, Mr. Vondra for ECR.
Thank you very much. So wishing you good luck in your job, and thanks for being with us. On the climate and the Green Deal, I think leading by example is a great thing, but it makes a sense only if the other follows, both within our societies as well as the great power outside. So that's the first question. You know, what are you preparing to do to convince particularly those outside of Europe, to follow the trend? Secondly, it will have a profound and far-reaching effect on our industries, on our societies, and on our policies too, because I think just the French example, when they try to implement just carbon tax, and the outrage among the population shows us what lies ahead of us. And not all our societies are same, not our economies are same. For example, the Poles, Czechs are very much dependent on the coal. So where we will have the resources to do, to cover that far-reaching policies? Where are you planning to gain the money for this? Thirdly, in Europe, I would say, just based on observation in the last couple of years, the key problem is a drought. rather than the heat. The forests, and we are, I would say, rightly concerned about deforestation in Amazonia or Indonesia, but the forests in Europe are dying, at least in a part of Europe, because of the bad water management. And, you know, just reading your statement, reading many other statements, there is nothing about water in a sense of increasing our ability to contain the water in the countryside and to fight with the drought, which has also a far-reaching impact, not just on the population, but also on the biodiversity. So that's my third question regarding water management.
Thank you. So the last speaker for coordinator, Silvia Modig for the GUE.
Kiitos, arvoisa puheenjohtaja. Arvoisa ministeri Mikkonen.
Thank you, Chair. Minister Mikkonen, the Finnish presidency is at a very challenging time. We have very important questions to solve, and I would like to thank you for the fact that the climate challenge is in the center of your program. Now, we're not talking about the fact that we would be crazy about the climate. Instead, we have scientific evidence for this, and we must have socially just solutions to this problem. This is my first question. How can Finland promote the fact that the ecological restructuring will be done in a socially equitable way? It affects different areas in different ways and people with different income levels. How will Finland affect this? It is really good that Finland wants to have a long-time strategy and a carbon-neutral economy by the year 2050, but we also need faster solutions, such as reducing emissions by 55% by the year 2030. The ETS also needs to be developed. With Minister Leppä, we talked about the carbon sinks, for example, in forests, and biodiversity was not touched upon so much. You, however, talked about this, and you said that we're creating a strategy which could be measurable and which could actually affect this work. As you said, we are lagging behind combating biodiversity loss. Biodiversity as such, of course, is a value in itself, but it will also increase the resilience to the planet warming up. And this is in a very central position when we try to solve climate change problems. So about the strategy, what are the concrete measures that you could do, and how can you ensure that during the Finnish presidency we will be able to change our direction as to conserving biodiversity? Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I'm not fluent in Finnish. So, thank you very much for this first round of questions. You have 10 minutes, if you can stick to that, for the first round of answers.
Okay. Thank you, and I'm going to speak in Finnish now, so if you want to hear what I'm speaking, you might need these headsets. Kiitos hyvistä kysymyksistä.
Thank you very much for your pertinent questions. You made very good observations, and we had a good discussion on what we should do together in order to meet the climate challenge. And several questions raised the point that this is a work where we need short-term solutions as well as having long-term solutions. But long-term solutions are not enough unless we get up to speed quickly. Peter Liese raised the ambitious climate objectives of Madame van der Leyen. We have looked into that as well, and I'm very, very pleased that she did emphasize these themes. And during the Finnish presidency, we will stress very similar objectives. But, of course, as a representative of the Council, I'm going to go very deeply into the ways in which the Commission should work on this. But I was very pleased to see that these themes came up. And it is true that we must work hard in order to get other countries on board. The EU can show an example, and we have a chance for that, but we must really get other countries up to speed as well. Set Dance took up the aspect that people want to do more, and on the other hand, there is resistance towards change when decisions are taken, and both concerns have to be addressed. On the one hand, we know that our youth is very concerned about our future, and this was pointed out by Michael Bloss as well. Young people want concrete action, but on the other hand, we are well aware that when we take decisions that have an impact on everyday life, there is a group of people who are concerned, and we have seen these movements, which means that it's extremely important to come up with socially sustainable solutions. We must certainly pay attention to this, and we do recognize that there are regional differences in Europe, and because of historic differences, because of differing energy solutions, there are areas when it's much harder to get rid of fossil fuels than in other areas. We must take that into account. Nevertheless, we must jointly try to find a solution for the whole of Europe. Europe must reach its goals, and these are not goals as such. We must mitigate climate change, and this must be multi-sectoral work. These two of us asked me, where should we start? The way I see it is, we cannot start with this or that sector, with a single sector. Climate change touches upon all sectors, and that's why the theme should be mainstreamed. We need environmental actions, but also energy actions, transport, housing, construction, in all human actions. And of course, our economic system should be such that it supports and incentivizes climate-friendly solutions. Michael Bloss drew our attention on the UN summit. On the one hand, the 2050 carbon neutrality goal of Europe, and then on the other hand, he asked can we ensure that these decisions are in line with the Paris Accord. Everything that we do must be compatible with Paris. And during the Finnish presidency, our objective is that we could agree on the 2050 goal, but obviously everyone in Europe must reflect on practical actions, and we must ensure that our actions are in line with the Paris Treaty, and we need to have further discussions on that. Teuvo Hakkarainen was doubtful about the existence of climate change because the climate has always been a variable. It is true that the climate has always been variable in our history. We have had ice ages and all that, but it's clear and obvious that climate change is underway and it is anthropomorphic. Human actions have speeded it up in an unprecedented way, and we decision takers must be able to make science-based decisions, and there's a very strong consensus in the science world on this subject. This is the result of human action. I'm not going to answer questions related to Finland because I'm representing the council. I'm not representing Finland. Mr. Vondra took up the issue of leading by example, and he asked how can we get third countries on board and joining in. I do believe that the things that we do ourselves they give the strong message to others. Given the know-how of the European Union, the technological opportunities, the wealth that we have, the strength of our democracies, given all that, if a union of countries like this doesn't show a good example, it would be very peculiar, odd indeed. And I'm sure that the rest of the world will join in. Because looking at the long run, and even in the short run, the question is, how can we keep on living on this planet? How can societies stay alive? Coal dependence is a fact. As I already said, every country has its own history. We have to take this into account, and we must ensure that we come up with a fair change. We must support regions. We have strong know-how across Europe. We can retrain people. We can support regions that are further behind and have more to catch up with. No one will be left behind.
Muista pois, vaan me haluamme yhdessä mennä yhteiseen suuntaan. Kuivuus nostettiin myös Vondran puheessa esiin.
Drought was also an issue that was taken up as Mr. Vondra. But drought is an outcome. It is caused by heat. And because water management is a central part of Finnish policy, and the Finnish presidency aims at improving the reuse of water. That's one of the goals. We want an agreement on that. There are areas where irrigation is needed, and we want to find safe ways of recycling water, and the Commission is reviewing water policy, and the Council will take this up immediately after the Commission's paper is ready. Silvia Moody took up the question of social justice. It is a crucial issue, because creating structural changes has to take place in a fair way, so that citizens will agree on this. Citizens want to do more, but we have to do justice to the needs of regions and people, and we have to be socially fair so that the poorest will not pay up for this. Biodiversity was raised here. It is true that biodiversity is somehow in this, to an extent, in the shade of climate change, even though there's a clear linkage, because climate change will lead to more biodiversity loss. And on the other hand, we know that the more biodiverse our nature is, the more resilient and adaptive our nature is, which is why we have started preparations for the 2020 biodiversity agreement. We want to be active here in order so that the European Union, together with other countries, can agree on a good treaty. We do have a good treaty. We are committed, but we have not made progress. But the more measurable the objectives are, the better the implementation, the easier the implementation. And implementation is of the essence. And the Paris Treaty is a good example of the way we want to go. We have to have clear objectives and country-by-country plans that create commitments and obligations. There must be measured goals and measurements of reaching goals. That's the way to go. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are going to move to the second set of questions. I will have 7 questions for the first round. Then I will allow you for 5-7 minutes for answers, and then the last round. So we start with the PP, Edina Toth.
Thank you, Chair. Dear Minister, I very much welcome that climate protection is among the main priorities of the Finnish presidency. We have to set and achieve EU climate goals in a way so that it wouldn't hurt our global competitiveness and it wouldn't contribute to emission increase in third countries either. The EU's long-term carbon neutrality strategy requires more debate and discussions. Instead of ideological debates, in my opinion, we must focus on analysis while understanding member states that struggle to meet the preliminary targets. Climate goals must be achieved in a technology-neutral way with sufficient EU budget allocated to reach the results. It is very important that each party has to contribute to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. The EU sets a good example, but it's necessary for other countries in the world to set similarly ambitious goals as well. Dear Minister, what are the aims of the Finnish presidency in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you. Timo Volken from SND.
Ja, vielen Dank zunächst.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. First of all, I have two questions. The first one is in relation to aviation. Aviation is certainly one of the sectors where emissions are growing the most in the EU. There's a lot of public attention to aviation as well, more so now than ever before. So my question is, what kind of measures do you want to promote to find solutions? There are two possibilities as we see it. Either you price kerosene across the EU, that could be one option, or you coordinate the exemption of paying VAT for aviation, and that might make sense too. And then my second question is in relation to Mrs. von der Leyen. By 2021, she would like to increase our emission reduction target to minus 55%. We welcome that, but do you think that is enough? In particular against the backdrop that there are national binding targets under the Paris Agreement and that those need to be notified by 2020. Thank you.
Martin Osik for Renew.
Thank you, Chair. Dear Minister, first of all, great to see that the priority on the climate, biodiversity and circular economy are there. And as a person coming from Slovakia, I'm very happy that it is possible also for the Central European countries to commit to carbon neutrality. It's about willingness and really the drive forward. But what is stopping us, I think, quite a bit is the incoherence of the policies, where on one hand we say we're going to cut down the carbon, but also, and it's an EU-wide problem, we still support with direct and indirect subsidies as well as with the export credits or other financial instruments further development of the fossil fuels. So what the Finnish presidency plans to do in this regard, and also one of the dossiers that you failed to mention, I would wonder whether you want to close it, is the taxonomy of the green investments. Thank you.
Thank you. For the Greens, Aileen MacLeod.
Minister, I come from Scotland, which, like Finland, supports more ambitious EU climate change measures and targets that recognise the scale and urgency of the climate emergency we face and enable us to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, including the 1.5 degrees goal. Now, September's UN Climate Summit is a pivotal moment to step up the global climate ambition and our climate action. Now, with the EU still to reach agreement on the 2050 climate neutrality target and adopt its long-term strategy, my question is this, what is the EU actually going to say in New York, especially with a raft of countries that having already indicated that they will ramp up their climate commitments at the summit? And what will be, the core message that the EU takes to the summit? Thank you very much, Minister, and I wish you all the very best with your presidency.
Thank you. Michel Fisik for the EPP.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. I really appreciate this opportunity. Over here. Over here. Oh, no problem. I will proceed in Slovak, if you allow. Fínsko chce byť uhlíkovo neutrálne do roku 2035. Aká je úloha lesných ekosystémov pri...
We are to be carbon neutral by 2050, but how about the contribution made by ecosystems to achieving this goal and carbon sequestration? It could have a negative impact on the forestry industry. Now, Finland, of course, has the bioeconomy, but wood mass is important as well. But how will all of this tie in with the forestry industry? And do you think there might be a negative impact on countries and forests as a result of the efforts when it comes to carbon sequestration? For example, in Slovakia, there is degradation of forests, in particular because the production function of forests is not looked at critically, and I think forests should be looked at from the point of view of ecosystems. Thank you.
For SND, Delara Bucart.
Dear Minister Mikkonen, dear colleagues, as SND, we want to pursue policies that meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. Meeting this challenge will demand great transformations in the way we live, produce, consume, but also will have many effects on the aspects of life in economic, social, and environmental challenges at the same time. A just transition, taking social considerations in climate action into account, is not to water down ambition, but to enable ambition. And it's necessary that people not fall for people that deny the human-made climate change, but listening better to the young people in the Fridays for Future protest that call the climate change as something, what is it? A crisis that we have to tackle. The United Nations 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals are perfect framework to do so. So I'm asking you, in the absence of an overarching EU Sustainable Development Strategy, how is the Finnish presidency intending to better reflect the UN Sustainable Development Goals in the policy making of the EU and its member states in the European semester, for example?
Thank you. Catherine Griset for ID.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. Madam Minister, you're going to make the climate cause the #1 priority of your presidency, and for that you're going to have to carry out a good diagnosis and apply the right treatment. At the time when free trade agreements that are being signed one after another are creating increased flows of trade which mean more pollution, the European Union is trying desperately to respect the Paris Accords that are not being fully respected anyway. Some countries are also struggling with this because of impossible targets. And then there are financial flows going to southern countries to the tune of 100 billion euros. And then other countries are actually logging in forests and creating coal plants whilst other activities are going on. We are saying that environmental action is contrary to free trade policy. So perhaps we have to do away with these large international agreements and go back to regional and local level, Minister, and let the member states decide, because they are aware of the challenges in their own territories and are able to efficiently respond to them. Thank you.
5 minutes, if you could focus your answers on specific questions, so that we can take also from this exchange of views concrete announcements or proposals by the Commission, by the Council. Sorry.
Kiitos.
Thank you for these questions. The first question was about competitiveness and our understanding of different circumstances. This is extremely important, and we do understand that the circular economy is one way to proceed. We wish to promote it, and it will increase our competitiveness. We know that we are trying to find solutions as to how we can harness climate change. And this is a really good possibility for us, and this is a concrete way of doing it, which we wish to promote during our presidency. Mr. Vulcan asked us about aviation, and these issues are dealt with the Transport Council, and Minister Marin is here today, actually, meeting people on this issue, and in the concerned committee. Finland will organize an additional meeting of the Ministers of Transport to discuss these different objectives, not only for aviation, but all types of transport. And it is clear that we need global as well as regional decisions in this respect, so that we will not endanger the objectives of the Paris Agreement. The aviation is growing and it causes a lot of emissions, and we do know that our citizens are willing to economically harness aviation, and they are willing to pay for it. So how this will be done exactly, I do not know yet, and I cannot tell you at this moment. The next question was about sustainable finance, and this is actually not something that I deal with. Our Ministry of Finance, Lintilä, is the one who is dealing with these issues. But of course, it is important that we will have sustainable financing and an agreement on that. And Finland, as the presidency, has also taken this up as one priority. This is very important to us. And our goal is that we would be able to agree on the mandate in the Council, and that we could start the trilogue as soon as possible in the fall. The next question was from Ms. MacLeod, who asked us about the summit, the UN summit, and the EU's input. We discussed this in our informal ministerial meeting, and it is important that the EU emphasizes its commitment to the objectives including this 1.5 degree goal. This means that this is also a long-term objective that we must work on in the Council, and it is important to work on this in the time frame of 2020. And Finland also wants to ensure that the ambitious commitments that we have in the EU, the EU's role as a very important financer in this respect, will be made clear. But it is, of course, true that even though we have legislation which is excellent, it also requires the member states to act and implement this legislation. Then we had a following question from Mr. Vincig. Land use and the forest sector is, of course, in a very important position when we're talking about climate change, mitigation, and achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. And this is why we must look not only at the emissions, but also at the sinks, and the forests are a sink. So forestry as such is dealt with by the member states, but of course we must see to it that we fulfill the LULUCF directive, and when we're talking about the forest, it is important to remember the biodiversity questions. They are important since the forests are so important for our biodiversity. And then Mr. Burkhardt took up the equitable transformation, which is, of course, is very important. It enables our ambitious climate policy. It is very important to include everyone, and we're talking about, for example, different age groups. The young are especially worried, and we must give them answers. We must also see to it that nobody feels like they are the ones paying for everything. We must proceed in an equal way. And the SDGs, these are something which are very important for us during the presidency. It is also important that we proceed here and that they are considered when we are making our decisions. Then we have Mrs. Krista, who asked about trade agreements. And how we take into consideration how we ensure that we can have carbon sequestration, and if we take a look at trade policy, how we take climate questions into consideration. This, of course, in my opinion, is a question which should mainstream climate policy in all of our different policies, both globally and nationally, because this is not a question for only one sector when we talk about climate policy.
Thank you. Yeah, so we are moving to the last set of questions. There are 7 speakers, and there are additional requests. So if we have time, we might find the slots for 5 additional speakers, depending on the first 7. So it's up to you to stick to the 1 minute. Let's start with Alan Kanev from EPP.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mrs. Minister. You said you're reluctant to discuss Finnish politics. Still, I think the political experience of any politician in his own country is crucial to his understanding of European politics. So I would ask you to answer based on your own political experience and not discuss Finnish politics. First question about codependency of energy production is, do you think that moving from coal to massive nuclear energy production is a good idea, and would it be acceptable to the large European public generally? Next one, very much related to this, is how do you think best in the perspective of climate change politics, European energy could escape heavy Russian geopolitical dependency. And last one, again, very much related to the realities of Finnish, but far not only Finnish politics. Is,
quickly, please.
Yes. What do you think is the future of European steel production with the perspective of climate change policies? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. For SND, César Luena.
Sí, gracias.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Minister. I'd like to highlight the need to push back against climate denial and regression. Now, in central Madrid, there's been a series of measures that have produced good results, and that's had an impact on public health for the inhabitants of Madrid. So, in the last plenary, we mentioned this, but in Spain, I have to say there isn't a cordon sanitaire against the far right. No. And what has happened is that now we've got them in place, and that means this set of measures have been pushed back. But let me just say to you, if you have a set of measures that is good for public health and you reduce pollution in a city centre, you should not be able to backpedal on that. That's really important. And then finally, when it comes to the use of wastewater for agricultural purposes, we're very happy about the way that the talks are going on. You mentioned this, but I have a request for you. I hope that we'll be able to push this through successfully, as you said you had hoped as well. Thank you.
Thank Thank you. Susana Solis Perez for Renew.
Gracias. Thank you very much indeed, Minister. Thank you for being here. We're very happy that climate change and the circular economy are going to be top priorities for the Finnish presidency. I have a question for you in that vein. What concrete measures are you going to propose to guarantee that the circular economy will be applied as a modus operandi across all sectors and all value chains? So how are we going to strengthen the link between the circular economy and our climate change objectives? And then, related to that, you also said during your presentation that the European Commission has evaluated the report with the 54 measures for the circular economy and identified the textile sector as one of the sectors where we really have more work to do. This is an industry sector, for example, that uses a lot of resources. There's a big environmental impact, but it's also extremely important in terms of its role that it plays in the European economy. So my question is, what plans do you have to improve the focus on the circular economy in the textile sector, whilst at the same time aligning yourself with the climate objectives and making sure that competitiveness in European industry is maintained? Thank you very much indeed, and every success to you.
Thank you. For ECR, Ms. Wisniewska.
Dziękuję bardzo. Tutaj jestem. Dziękuję za Pani wystąpienie. Słuchałam go z uwagą.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Minister. I have listened to your remarks with great interest, but I was rather surprised at the fact that the balance between emissions and they're being reduced to 2040 is what you underscored. I think perhaps there's been a mistake there in what's been relayed. I do think that European industry, of course, does find itself in an ever difficult situation because basically you find that industries are being displaced outside of Europe now and relocated. And at the same time, you do have products coming into Europe which come from countries which do not, in fact, agree to our climate objectives. So in the European Union, we buy products from countries where in those specific countries, the CO2 imprint is in fact very high. So I do think that we should have a policy whereby the European industry should be enabled at really being viable. I'm very grateful for what you have said about social justice and the transformation there too. So I do think that just transfer is in fact what is of great importance on this.
And then everything blows up. So you have to respect the rule, please. Eva Kopacz from EPP.
Dziękuję bardzo, Pani Minister. Bardzo uważnie przeczytałam program prezydencji fińskiej i chcę powiedzieć na wstępie, że
Thank you very much. I wanted to say that I do support your priorities as presented by you this morning, but I'd like to just focus in on one specific objective. You are talking about renegotiation in terms of the environment measures, in terms of what is just as pertains to the specific objectives. How would you think that these specific objectives could be effectively put into practice without any sort of penalties for citizens in the EU, and to have a climate-friendly policy thereby? Now, as concerns legality being maintained, this is something which really comes back to the individual governments themselves, and also the funds that go to local administration, in fact, should also be available.
Thank you. The writer Jason Hickel has pointed out, in 2012, the last year we have figures for, $2 trillion flowed from developing countries into developing countries from the global north in aid, investment and loans. The same year, $5 trillion flowed from the south to the north. We cannot effectively tackle climate change while this system of capital and resource extraction remains in place. These countries in the global south are being locked into operating cheap raw material-based economies, and our tax havens make sure that no slice of the profits can be used to build up local infrastructure that is necessary to protect against climate disasters and to lessen the need for people to leave their homes in search of terrain where it's possible to live a viable existence. Do you believe, Minister, that we should take a holistic world view of the problems we face? My last question, will you oppose the Mercosur deal, yes or no? It's a disaster for the environment, it will lead to further deforestation of the Amazon, and it will put many of our smaller farmers who have the potential to produce clean food out of existence in Europe.
Thank you. Ivan Sincic for non-inscrits.
Minister Mikkonen, we have spoken here about an exchange of views about the climate, about biodiversity. The Finns are very proud of their forests. I want to talk about deforestation in Croatia. Corruption in Croatia can be seen through deforestation. The forests are managed by a state-owned company, and the plans are made as we know, they should be made hundreds of years in advance. In Croatia, 5 million meters of forests grew and 4 million were cut. However, this has been changed. Now they say the growth is 7.5 and that the logging is 6 million. But these numbers mean nothing. The growth has been inflated, but the cutting has not. Deforestation is sponsored and protected by the government, the ministry, and the company managing forests. How to put an end to this? Thank you.
So, in the remaining 7 minutes, a catch the eye with 5 speakers. I know there are more questions, but we can do more than that. Starting with the EPP, and Mr. Buzoy requested, but he's not there. So it's up to you to choose. 3 from the EPP, up to you. No, only 1 from the EPP? Okay, so yourself.
Dear Madam Minister, I'm very happy to see you here. I come from Slovenia, and the environment is a very important issue in Slovenia as well, especially the care of our rural regions. Many people from our rural regions travel to urban areas daily or even move to cities, which means that the emissions increase in that way as well. If you're talking about biodiversity, we are to preserve it. It has a cost of its own, which means that our farmers also lose some income because they do not use their surfaces covered in grass to the same extent. And then there is also an issue of the cleaning technology. I would like to ask you, what do you intend to do to preserve our rural environment, and do you plan to have some specific funds for that? Thank you.
Maria Rena.
Merci.
Thank you. Yes, a study was undertaken by a number of American scientists, which show that if we were to include in our carbon emissions the emissions of consumption, then the carbon emissions of Europe would in fact increase by 30%.
So, Madam van der Leyen has come with a proposal which talks about a carbon tax at the frontiers. So I think that is interesting as a carbon border tax per se, but how, under your presidency, are you going to actually propose a tool, an instrument whereby you can actually measure that and fall within what is provided for in international agreements now?
Stéphane Doutard.
Thank you, Chair. Madam Minister Mikkonen, summer is coming, but that also means that extreme weather is coming. We saw that every year the same story repeats itself. Every year our member states in about September to October will come to this Parliament and will apply to the Solidarity Fund, will apply to the Civil Protection Mechanism. My country, Romania, has applied to that last mechanism that I mentioned 18 times. It's almost like some ill people treat the emergency service instead of getting regular care. So my question to you is, how will you deal in order to have a sustainable disaster management system in Europe, one that is rich, one that has enough money, one that has enough resources to deal with the climate crisis, a climate crisis that none of us can deal with on our own? Thank you.
Thank you. Edi Otala for the Greens.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a question about the communication by the Commission on deforestation, how to tackle deforestation. It will be published today. And as Maria Arena has shown, many of our emissions are imported. So the Finnish government's program actually has a promise to look into due diligence of supply chains. And I think this is absolutely necessary if we want to stop importing deforestation and climate change and human rights violations. And I would ask you that would this not be something for the Environment Council and not just for Agriculture Council or Forest whatever council, because this is very much about environment. So please do everything you can to bring it to the table of the environment ministers.
Thank you. And the last one is for ECR, Ms. Zeliuska.
Panie Przewodniczący, koleżanki, koledzy, Pani Minister.
Yes, Chair, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Minister. Now, I would like to wish you every success in your determination. I mean, you only have 3 months. You don't have 6 months as such. I mean, really, we have to talk to the new Commission in terms of the budget as such, and that's going to be available at the end of September only. So my second point here is, do you have any idea as to how the budget is going to look? And here I'm referring to protection of water, what sort of budgetary means have been set aside for that purpose. And also, I think that we ought to be looking from different directions on. It's not simply a matter of use of water, it's a matter of consumption of water and what sort of price is to be paid for its consumption.
So you have 5 minutes to answer this last set of questions, okay?
Kiitoksia jälleen.
Thank you again for excellent and versatile questions. I will try to answer them in the following. Mr. Kanev raised the issue of energy production and the Finnish solutions that we have here. I would be pleased to discuss the Finnish experience in the area of energy policy, but here and now I'm representing the Council, but it is true that the energy sector has a crucial role in achieving climate goals, and this applies to all countries, which means that we have to look for solutions that help us to get rid of a fossil economy, and we must find solutions that allow for a short-term transition. And if we look at Finnish solutions, then the nuclear power is not a solution. We've been building a power plant for tens of years now, and it's still not been completed. Then the reuse of water was taken up by Luena, and it is so that Finland wants to get this regulation finished, so that the regulation would be adopted and agreed on and adopted this year during the Finnish presidency. That's a significant objective. Solis Perez asked us about tangible actions in the area of circular economy. The circular economy is certainly a priority of Finland, and we want to reduce greenhouse emissions and biodiversity loss through that. And the textile industry that you took up is one of the sectors that we really need to take a critical look at, because we are aware that the textile industry offers many chances of using resources more sustainably. We can ensure that the environmental and climate impact of the textile industry can be reduced. Madam Wisniewska drew up our attention to just transformation, and she emphasized that different regions face different challenges in terms of reaching carbon neutrality, and certainly Finland wants to have discussions with member states and take into account that the starting points differ. Fair transition is a goal. Everybody must be included. That's of utmost important. And Kovac talked about the principle of rule of law, and Finland has stressed that it's an extremely important issue, but it does not really fall into my portfolio, so I can't answer the question. I can only say that it is one of our priorities, and we find it extremely important. Mr. Wallace talked about the Mercosur agreement. I fully understand that its effects are a cause for concern. I do understand that you discussed this yesterday with my colleague, Minister Leppä, and it is very important that the agreement contains, as the latest EU agreements do, it should contain a chapter on sustainable development. These issues are now baked into these treaties in a different way than before, and the precautionary principle should always be included when you take decisions on matters that have an environmental impact. Well, since again, Hautala emphasized deforestation. Deforestation is a serious issue indeed. And as we know, the Commission communication on deforestation is coming up. The Commission communication is on global deforestation. It aims at improved implementation of existing measures and instruments, both in the EU and globally, to fight deforestation. Finland is prepared to fight deforestation during the Finnish presidency, and when the Commission launches its communication, we will look into it, and we'll look at it from the perspective of biodiversity and climate change as well. And then there was a question on how to ensure that there's global participation in fighting climate change, and how can we take this into account better with trade agreements. And it's certainly true that we must all work together, because most of the carbon emissions come from consumption of things, goods that have been produced outside the EU, and we must do everything that the environmental impact would be counted in globally, and that we can direct consumption in a better way. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Nous arrivons à la...
Thank you very much. We have now come to the end of this first exchange of views for this morning. Thank you very much, Madam Minister. You have finished just on time. So we're just going to have a few minutes break before we move on to the second exchange of views, which will be with your colleague, the Finnish Minister of Family Affairs and Social Services, Krista. So 5 minutes break.